It has come to my attention some open source lovers, I should say. Let's keep it nice and clean. Some open source lovers have been making some ruckus about some information coming out with the Raspberry Pi team. Let's run into this. My name is Kai. This is Kai Likes Linux. And to be clear, I love open source software. I use open source software on the daily, and I really do not like the proprietary alternatives unless I have to do it for school, like Microsoft Windows, which I am currently on because I am in high school and they require it for most of the applications I run. Anyways, that aside, let's understand one thing. The Raspberry Pi Foundation is an educationally based foundation, not open source based. But we will get into that a little further in the video. So I watched a video by Gardner Bryant, who is one of my favorite Linux YouTubers on the platform. And I have to say, for once, I actually kind of really severely think he's an idiot in this situation. And the reason I'm making this video is because I'm actually kind of pissed. Not at Gardner himself, but at the people who just simply do not understand the situation. Now, Gardner is not the only one to be spouting bullshit about the whole Raspberry Pi Foundation and the Microsoft VSCode repo and the Raspberry Pi OS. To put it simply, I looked at his thing. I watched his video, and 10 hours ago, he posted a poll saying, "Good morning, my loveliest friends. What do you think of the inclusion of Microsoft's VSCode repo in Raspberry Pi OS?" And of course, I clicked, "No, I'm not worried at all." Because, the options were it's a betrayal of trust. It's not. It's concerning. No, there's no reason to be concerned. It's not that big of a deal. Sure, it's not that big of a deal. Yeah, it changes some things for some people, but oh well. And I personally picked, I'm not worried about it at all. I want you to guess the two options that were the most popular. It's not concerning, and slightly below it's not a big deal is it's a betrayal of trust. 21% of people who watch Gardner Bryant think it's a betrayal of trust. How is it a betrayal of trust? How is this a betrayal of trust in any way, shape, or form? Okay, I see one comment that gives me I don't agree with it, but I can respect the opinion. Software repos should never be added without consent. I guess if it came out of nowhere for you, sure, that's kind of shitty, but this is Raspberry Pi's operating system. They get to control it. Don't like it, use something else. But here's the problem with these people who think, "Oh no, Raspberry Pi Foundation just betrayed all of FOSS. They were a FOSS company, and now they're supporting proprietary software." Shut up. Shut up. No, they're not. They were. First off, yes, they're supporting proprietary software. That's the only part of that sentence that's correct. But no, they're not an open source foundation. They should not be considered as an open source foundation. There is open source as my green screen works. Yeah, it's often open source as my green screen often works, but at the same time, they're their own people and they don't agree with how you want things to be 100% of the time. I hate how my green screen does this, or maybe it's my camera. I hate my camera too. Either way, it sucks, but that's beside the point. I looked this up. I'm like, okay, maybe they put some wording in their website or their Wikipedia that makes people think they're an open source foundation, because they're not. And I looked through the Wikipedia, I searched for keywords, I read through the entire thing, I read their foundation about page. The only mention of free software is this quote right here. "We make computing and digital making accessible through providing low-cost, high-performance single-board computers and free software." They're not considering it free software as in the GNU kind of free software, but rather the free software that is basically just freeware. Like VS Code, Chrome. These two things are more or less proprietary, but, they're still free. They never mentioned open source. They never mentioned FOSS. They never mentioned OSS. They never mentioned any of that in their website. And here's why this is a very, very dumb opinion for most people to have. Oh no, they're adding a repo for the most popular IDE/code editor out there. How dare they? Oh, I'm so offended. No, shut up. If you can't tell, I'm genuinely pissed off about this because, one, I use VSCode. It's good. VSCodium is also what removes the proprietary features. Two, VSCode is open source, technically, but their binaries are closed source because they have the proprietary nature in it. Otherwise, you could literally clone it from the GitHub repo, which is under the MIT license, if I remember correctly, and the binary and the repo are completely different in one aspect of the telemetry. VS Code is open source and telemetry free if you get it from the repo or VSCodium. But otherwise, closed source, and that's perfectly fine. Them adding Microsoft's little repo to add the proprietary version of VS Code, the most popular code editor out there, as far as I can tell, according to the Stack Overflow survey, it is always on top for the past couple years. And trust me, I look at that thing thoroughly each year. It's a fucking meme to say, oh, the Raspberry Pi Foundation broke the trust of the open source community. They never once promised open source everything. They never once promised that. Never. Two, they are their own foundation. They're a company. They have to make money, and sometimes that includes, just partnering with people, including Microsoft, to get the most popular code editor on the market for programmers into their operating system. The Raspberry Pi OS is not a Linux distro as in to give everyone a FOSS alternative to a Windows PC in a very lightweight ARM factory. No. The Raspberry Pi OS is a free version of, it's a free as in free beer operating system for kids to use in order to learn computer science. The Raspberry Pi Foundation did not break any promises of open source everything, and they did not break any, they did not break trust. They did not betray the open source community. There is no betrayal here, and it's insulting to think people think there's actual betrayal here. There's a tweet by Joe Ressington that I want to quote real quick. The Raspberry Pi's Foundation, the Raspberry Pi Foundation's priorities have never been software freedom or open source. Linux has always been a means to an end for them, which basically means a way for people to access the hardware in the first place. That end is educating kids for computer science. The Raspberry Pi OS is like, I'm paraphrasing here and adding some things, but the Raspberry Pi OS was designed to just be there for kids, be a way for kids to learn about computer science and access the hardware because they didn't know if OS manufacturers would do that in the first place. There was no promise of that. I'd love them to care more about FOSS, but they just don't. None of this is news. It's really not. The whole Raspberry Pi freakout is nothing. This is a way overblown situation. If you're using the Raspberry Pi OS, you're not using it. You shouldn't. It's not designed to be used as a personal desktop environment for people of the FOSS community. That's not what they make Raspberry Pi OS for. The Raspberry Pi OS is 100% designed for kids to learn how to code, to learn how computer science works. It is to educate kids and nothing more, nothing less. So please, This is not news about the whole Raspberry Pi situation. Stop freaking out about the whole Raspberry Pi situation. It's simply not news. It's simply not something for FOSS people to care about. And trust me, I am a FOSS lover. I use FOSS every minute I can. But serious, and I develop FOSS only. I don't make any of my code proprietary anymore. This whole Raspberry Pi OS situation is a joke. It's a meme. People who are freaking out about this are idiots and nothing less. The Raspberry Pi Foundation did not break trust in any way, shape, or form. And the 21% of people who said that it's a betrayal of trust, shut up. It's not. It's literally not. And if you think it is, please educate yourself on what the Raspberry Pi Foundation is. It's an educational tool foundation for kids to learn computer science. And I will repeat this a million times over so you'll understand this. Raspberry Pi Foundation has nothing to do with FOSS. They don't develop for FOSS. They don't provide to FOSS. Well, that's not true, but they're not about FOSS. They're not about FLOSS. They're not about OS. They're not about COS. They're not about CLOS. It's about, I want you to listen closely, educating kids on computer science. The 42% who said it's concerning. Why? I want to hear your opinion on why it's concerning. If you're the people who think it's betrayal of trust, please leave a dislike and fuck right off. But if you think it's concerning, why? What part of this is concerning? I really want to know. I want to know what people are concerned about. If you're concerned about, oh, they're not protecting FOSS, and, well, shut up. I don't want to hear that, because that's not the problem here. If you're worried about the Raspberry Pi Foundation playing with FOSS, that's not their goal. It was never once their goal. So please, tell me what's wrong with this situation without saying it's betrayal of trust to the FOSS community. And don't even say anything about telemetry or Microsoft repositories in the OS. Well, I mean, as in it belonging to Microsoft. This is not, FOSS was never their plan. FOSS was just something that they could access and give to kids to learn. The Raspberry Pi is a tool to learn. I have a couple Raspberry Pis. I have a Raspberry Pi 4, a 4GB version, and a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus. And I understand the Raspberry Pi Foundation was never about open source. I never got the hardware because it was open source. I got the hardware because I like ARM and I like RISC-V, which I am getting, hopefully I'm getting a Beagle board when they release. I really want a Beagle board. And if you don't know what a Beagle board is, that's a story for another time. I'll link an OMG Ubuntu article in the description down below for the Beagle board. But if you've known anything, this has been Guy Likes Linux, and have a wonderful day, everybody. And remember, the Raspberry Pi Foundation has nothing to do with FOSS.